Most people think about the government in America. They think about the president. Hopefully, you've learned through our first 12 chapters that the president isn't near as powerful or responsible for as many things as we tend to give him credit for or blame for. So let's look at the presidency, how that works. Americans, on the one hand, like the idea of a powerful president. Andrew Jackson, Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I would say LBJ, powerful presidents who got what they wanted done. But then at the same time, we have a fear of power being concentrated into too few hands. And so anytime a president acts powerfully, there's a reaction to that as well. It says, hey, wait a minute, is this a dictator? Lincoln is a great example. Now, the formal requirements to be president, you got to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural-born citizen. What that means, nobody's really settled on this as far as I can tell. For example, today a lot of people think that means you have to be born in the United States. But in 1968, Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, ran for president. He was born in Mexico, and nobody cared. In fact, in 2008, one of the candidates wasn't born in the United States. John McCain, the Republican nominee, was born in Panama. But because he was born there because his father was an admiral in the Navy, people said that was okay, which I think was right. So it's not really clear what natural-born citizen means. You also have to have resided in the United States for 14 years. Informally, there have historically been some other requirements. Every single person who's ever been president, except for one, has been white. Barack Obama is, of course, half white and half African American. Every single person who's ever been president, with no exceptions, has been male. And every single person who's ever been president, with one exception, has been a Protestant. The exception here being John F. Kennedy, who was Catholic. I would also point out that every person who's ever been president has been wealthy to some extent. Some have been wealthier than others. A few were born poor and worked their way up. But by the time they get the office, they have all been richer, much richer than the average American. All manner of professions, backgrounds have ended up in the Oval Office, but mostly political ones. Most people who get elected president have served in some government office. Governors lately have been very successful. But we've also seen, of course, generals, and there's been senators and House members who've risen to that post. Here's some recent presidents, and you can see their backgrounds here. If you want to pause and take a look at this, you can get a sense of the backgrounds of the presidents. How they get there? Well, the normal road to the White House, of course, is to win the election. We've done a whole chapter on elections, so hopefully you know how that works. Once elected, the president serves a term of 4 years. Now, previously, presidents could serve as many terms as they could get elected to. But Washington established a tradition after his second term of saying 8 years is enough for any man to be president and stepping down. That tradition was followed by Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson. Grant tried to run for a third term, but didn't get the nomination. So he actually didn't follow that tradition, but it didn't matter because he wasn't successful anyway. Teddy Roosevelt tried to get a third term when running again in 1912. Woodrow Wilson probably would have tried for a third term, but fell ill. And FDR, of course, who was elected in 1928, 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944, will win the presidency 4 times, which is perfectly legal. He violated the tradition, but he wasn't the first to attempt to do it. He was just the first to succeed in doing it. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment was passed that limited the president to 2 terms. Now, in reality, the president is limited to 2.5 terms. So if the vice president takes over more than halfway through the president's term, he could run for 2 more terms. So, for example, LBJ took over more than halfway through JFK's term, so he ran in 64 and could have run and started to run in 1968. If he had have taken over earlier in JFK's term, he would have only been able to run for 1 more. Most presidents have been elected to office. But of course, some presidents become president because they're vice president, and the president either dies or, in the case of Nixon, resigns. Under the 25th Amendment, the vice president becomes the acting president if the vice president and the president's cabinet determine that the president is disabled. We've actually seen this happen. For example, we've had presidents who've been put under for surgery, and the vice president has been the acting president. George H.W. Bush acted as president briefly a couple of times during the Reagan administration, and Dick Cheney acted as president, I believe, once when George W. Bush was getting some work, some medical work done during that presidency. Impeachment. Impeachment is not removal. You need to understand that. A lot of people think impeaching means you've been removed from office. It's not. It's an accusation. And all this requires is a majority vote by the House to impeach you. And you've been accused. Treason may be brought for treason, or charges may be brought for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, what are high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, it's whatever the House decides they are. We'll talk about specifically some impeachments here in this chapter. And you can see that both of the impeachments we've had in American history are fairly clearly political impeachments where the Congress simply didn't like the president and decided to go after him. If impeached, the president is tried by the Senate and the Chief Justice is the judge in the case. Only 2 presidents have been impeached, Johnson and Clinton. Neither were convicted. Johnson was the president, of course, after Abraham Lincoln was killed, and he was from Tennessee. He was a Southerner. And the radical Reconstructionists didn't like him because he was more sympathetic to the South, among other things. And so they passed some laws specifically limiting the president's power that were blatantly unconstitutional. They said he couldn't hire and fire generals or cabinet members specifically. And so when he broke these laws, which were clearly designed to be broken and they were unconstitutional, they tried to impeach him. But Republicans in the Senate came to their senses and realized that we couldn't be throwing presidents out over politics. In the 1990s, 1998, the Republicans in Congress went after Bill Clinton for having an extramarital affair and lying about it in a deposition, which my understanding is technically slightly different from perjury. But there was a great argument at the time, is lying about sleeping with an intern a high crime and misdemeanor. Of course, Democrats tended to say no, Republicans tended to say yes. But Clinton wasn't removed. Nixon would have been removed for his activities surrounding the Watergate scandal, but he resigned. That's why he resigned, because he realized, in fact, Republicans came to him, he was a Republican, and told him that they were going to impeach and remove him, so he stepped down. Of course, many presidents have died in office, and here's a list, and you see who the vice president who steps in there. If you go back to our discussion about constitutional change, or extra-constitutional change, informal change, you can learn the great story of William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. But these are presidents who become president because the person before hasn't served. You see it happens quite frequently. I think something like almost 1 in 4 presidents maybe became president by seceding from the vice presidency.